Welcome to Holmes Bible College online and to our Christian ethics course. This is lesson 4 and video 1, and we are taking a new direction now. We're going to get into some of the specific issues that confront Christian ethics and the church in particular in our American culture or in our global culture in some respects. So it's important for us to understand that where Christian ethics and where worldly ethics, that is secular ethics, intersect with one another, it often is a collision. It's a collision of worldviews. It's a collision of ideas. It's a collision of philosophies. It's a collision of lifestyles. It's a collision of culture. And what happens in those situations is it can often be acrimonious and difficult. And we've seen a lot of that recently, especially in America during the COVID period. We saw all kinds of violence. We saw all kinds of things going on that were extremely unsavory. And then we had a decision made by the Supreme Court to reverse the Roe versus Wade decision of 1973, and that erupted in a cataclysmic war over abortion rights, pro-life, pro-choice, and so forth. And so we've seen how these intersections can be very, very difficult and acrimonious. They are almost warlike in their violence. The consequences are that sometimes people act out, and with these collisions on ethics comes certain patterns of behavior, extreme on both sides, where violence is done sometimes, and where there are extreme words exchanged in the public square. It also affects public policy, and it affects the way the political class reacts and how they make decisions in their legislative roles. It affects the way the White House deals with society and the way it makes certain decisions in its bureaucracies throughout the executive branch of government. So these are not unimportant issues because they impact the daily lives of Americans, and especially those of us who believe in Christ or who are Christians and believe in a Christian worldview with Christian ethics. We are affected by these decisions. Now, I want to say this, and I do not want this to be in any sense considered political or pejorative, but I do want to say this. Christian ethics and biblical ethics are increasingly being marginalized in American society more and more. And it is marginalized under a particular rubric, a model, a particular template that is being placed upon Christian ethics and on the church by very often political entities or even the mainstream media, that the church is part of what is called the extreme right. That is the extreme political right, which means that they are for the legislating of morality and the clamping down on people's freedoms and people's ability to live their lives unmolested by moralists and judgmentalism. So there are several things that are going on in our society today that have actually bubbled to the surface. These are not new things. They've been fomenting for a very long time, but now they are bubbling to the surface, and we're seeing them acted out in the public square, and they're coming to a head. And we are, as Christians, going to have to deal with some of these issues, not only in our personal lives, because we talk about Christian ethics mainly with respect to the way we personally live, but we're going to have to confront it in the public square as part of who we are and our identity as Christians. If you identify as a Christian, you are looked at in a particular way, and Christian ethics is looked at in a particular way that we have to be able to explain in real terms to the society in which we live, if we are not to be misunderstood. Furthermore, if we're going to preach the gospel of God's grace, we are going to have to answer questions about Christian ethics, because the church and Christians are viewed through the lens very often of what is thought of as antiquated moralistic views that have no place in modern and contemporary society, and that becomes a hindrance to us preaching the gospel. In other words, the gospel is prejudged through a particular lens, a particular way of viewing the church. Now, this is nothing new. It's always been this way. But the church has to be able to speak up to those issues. So the reason we study Christian ethics is in order for us to be able to speak up intelligently and convincingly about the issues that we confront in our society and the moral views that we defend as believers. We have to be able to interact with the secular worldview as Christians and effectively communicate what the Christian worldview is, and not whatever caricature has been developed in the secular world concerning it. So the secular world views the church and Christian morals and Christian ethics in a particular way, which is usually a caricature of what it really is. And so our job or our responsibility is in that intersection between the Christian worldview and the secular worldview is to get the truth out there and on the table. All right. So having said that, that leads us into this idea that we're going to deal with the specifics in our society with respect to Christian ethics, the areas in our culture and maybe American culture or even globally that we have to address and speak to as Christians. We must speak to them because they're moral issues and they impact our ability to preach the gospel. And these are issues that we are going to be confronted with. However, before we can deal with those issues and speak about those issues, we have to understand what it is that causes so much friction between the Christian worldview and the secular worldview, and why the two worldviews collide. What is it that causes the heat and the destruction from the collision of those two worldviews? So we're going to speak, first of all, about the idea of truth. The idea of truth. The big issue in our conversation is truth. What is truth? Where does truth come from? What does truth look like? That is important because we'll talk about why it's important in a little while. But one of the things that is difficult is that the Christian worldview, if I can I call it this, the Christian worldview and the secular worldview have different ideas of what truth is. Truth in the Christian worldview is objective. It is absolute. In the secular worldview, truth is relative and it is changeable. Truth is not immutable in the secular worldview. So you can see how these two ideas and views of truth are going to come into collision with one another. So when the Christian says that there are some things that are true regardless of circumstances, time, location, geography, and all the rest of it, then it's going to come into collision with the secular worldview that says, no, truth is relative. Truth changes from person to person. Everybody has their own truth, and it is going to be different in different circumstances for different people. So truth is relative. You have to look at truth through the lens of the changing circumstances and the different perceptions that people have. Some people have one truth and other people have different truths, and they are all valid. All truth is valid, even though they may be different in content and substance. So we've got two different worldviews. This worldview says that truth is absolute, it doesn't change. And this worldview says, yes, it does change, it is relative, and people can hold different views, and they can still be considered to be valid truth. All right, so what do we do with that kind of reasoning? Before we talk about that in depth, let's go to another issue, because there are three major issues that the Christian worldview collides with the secular worldview in, and that the other two issues are the issue of judgmentalism and justice, often called social justice. These two issues are related to the issue of truth. Judgmentalism is the accusation that is made against the Christian worldview and the church and Christians in general, that they are the Christians judge morally other people. Now, that's not wrong. That's not wrong. Obviously, the Bible teaches us that we are sinners and that we are in need of salvation. So the moment the gospel goes out and calls people to repentance for their sin, there's a sense in which there is a recognition that there is a moral problem that needs to be overcome. But judgmentalism in its extreme form, from the secular worldview perspective, decries the idea that Christians judge everybody's behavior by their own standard and condemns that behavior. And that is something that has become anathema in our culture. We'll talk about that in the second video of this lesson. There's also the problem of social justice, the idea that all outcomes are not equal and that there's something unjust about the idea of unequal outcomes. If we are going to be fair and just, all outcomes should be the same. Everybody is entitled to the same outcome. And this has become the definition of justice, social justice in our society. And it comes into collision with another worldview, the Christian worldview, of what justice really is. And we'll get into that a little bit later on. All right, so let's begin then with a conversation about truth. It seems that it should be easy to define truth. What is truth? If you are talking about the Christian worldview and you're talking about a traditional view of truth, truth is what reality is. Truth is what reality is. Whatever reality is, whatever the world is, the way things are, that is truth. So when we make assertions about things and those assertions represent the way things really are, that is truth. When we make assertions and we say things about reality that are not that do not represent the way things are and do not accurately represent reality, we are not telling the truth. Now, on the personal level, this happens when we tell a lie. We say, no, I didn't eat those cookies, when in fact we did. The reality is that we were the ones that consumed the cookies. But we say, no, I didn't. So we are not telling the truth about what happened to the cookies if we say we didn't eat them, when in fact we did consume them. Now, in the secular worldview, the idea, this is a little bit of an exaggeration, but the idea wants to be held that if I say I didn't eat the cookies, that's my truth. Therefore, it's valid for me to say I didn't eat the cookies, when in fact, in reality, I did eat the cookies. So we run into a problem with definitions when it comes to truth. Truth, defined in its proper way, is whatever reality is, whatever things are, the way things are, whatever is. When we speak or represent that in a particular way, we have to represent it accurately. Otherwise, we are not telling the truth. Truth is representing reality accurately as it is. All right? Now, that's important. That definition is going to be very important as we go forward. Now, the reason that we have a problem in our society, or in our contemporary society, over definitions of truth and what truth is because of a particular philosophy that became current in the Enlightenment period, and it was formulated by a man called Immanuel Kant. A German philosopher. Kant said that reality is something we can only know through our senses. We can't know what is actually real. We can only know what our senses tell us about reality. In other words, whatever comes in through our senses, our sight, our ears, our hearing, touch, taste, and all the rest of it, that's how we gain our knowledge about reality. And then those senses are processed through our mental faculties. So our understanding of reality actually is indirect. It's not direct. So let's put this up here then. So our knowledge, according to Kant, of reality is indirect. We do not have a one-on-one knowledge of reality. We only have a knowledge or an experience of reality that is processed through our senses and through our mental faculties, the way we interpret it. Now, that means, Kant said, then everybody, we don't know what everybody else thinks about reality or how they experience reality. All we know is how we experience reality. We don't know how our neighbor experiences reality, or our children experience reality, or the people we go to work with. We don't know what their experience of reality is. It may be very different from ours. We just don't know. Because we can only know what we know about reality through our own senses. And so our knowledge of reality is individual, and it is personal. And therefore, we do not know, we have no idea whether our knowledge or experience of reality or our sense of reality is an accurate representation of what the way things really are. So Kant was what we call agnostic about reality. He says, actually, the way things really are, remember what truth is? Truth is asserting, making assertions about things the way they really are, about the way things really are. So Kant is saying that he is agnostic about reality. We don't really know what reality is because we only can know it indirectly through our senses and through our mental faculties, the way we process it. Okay, so that's interesting. You can immediately see then how this sort of an idea impacts the way we look at truth. Because what is said in the secular worldview is, okay, well, truth is the same way. We are agnostic about truth in the sense of truth representing what reality is, because really we don't know what reality is at all. All we know is what we know through our senses and through the interpretation of our mental faculties. So we can't know truth. This is where the idea comes from. We can't really know truth. Truth is relative to the person because all we can know is the truth. We can only know truth the way we interpret it and know it and sense it and experience it through our own personal senses and faculties and the way we process things. So you can see how this idea impacts the truth. And so what's happened is Immanuel Kant's agnosticism about reality has actually become an agnosticism about truth. We can't really know truth in its purest form. That is, we can't know the way things really are because we can't know reality. So truth then becomes something that has fuzzy boundaries. It is something that we can't really latch onto with any degree of certainty. So what we have here in this idea of truth, which now carries forward into our culture, is we have uncertainty. Whoops. About truth. We just don't know what is true. We know what may be true. We have a view of truth. You have a view of truth. In other words, you have a way of seeing things and I have a way of seeing things. But these, and even though they may diverge and be totally different or even contradictory to one another, that's your truth, that's my truth. They're equally valid ways of seeing the world because we can only see the world through our own lens, through our own senses, through our own interpretive apparatus. Okay? So I don't know if you feel this way, but that sounds so messy, doesn't it? It does, and it is. It's messy and it's unsatisfying, and it leaves us with a sense of, well, how do we make any progress forward if we can't know reality, if we can't know truth? Now, more recently, Immanuel Kant's ideas have come under criticism. And they've come under criticism for a number of reasons. First of all, Immanuel Kant developed his ideas about reality based on reason. The reasonable, and I'm going to put the word ness here, the reasonableness of reality. So what Immanuel Kant did is he thought out this philosophy through the using his mental apparatus and using his own thinking processes, and assuming, let me put this up here, assuming that reality was reasonable. Assuming the reasonableness of ultimate reality. Now, he said he doesn't know what ultimate reality is, but he's assuming the reasonableness of it. So he's using his reason and he's assuming the reasonableness of it. So in other words, Immanuel Kant is saying that through his deductive process, he has decided that he cannot know what reality is. That we can only know reality indirectly. And so immediately comes up the question, how does he know that? If we can't know reality, how does he know that his view of reality is correct? In other words, Immanuel Kant, if he is going to say, we only know reality in the sense of our indirect experience of it, how does he know that? The only way he can know that our experience of reality is indirect is if he has some knowledge of ultimate reality, what it really is like. But by his own philosophy, he says he doesn't. Therefore, his argument runs in a circle. It's a circular argument. It's what we call self-defeating. He smuggles into the argument the idea that he knows ultimate reality and that we, in fact, don't know what it really is like. And the only way he can say we only have an indirect experience of reality is if he knows what reality is. In other words, how does he know that our senses and the way we reason only deliver us an indirect experience of reality? He can't know that. He does not know whether our senses are one-for-one and direct experiences of reality or not, unless he knows what reality is, and he claims that he does not, or that we cannot. Therefore, his argument is circular and self-defeating. Does that make sense to you? I hope it does, because it's really, really important. His reasoning begs the question, and he assumes that he can objectively know reality in a way that he can say with certainty that our experience of reality is not objective. But of course, Immanuel Kant is doing the same thing we are doing. He is operating in the same world we're operating in. He's operating with the same faculties that we're operating with. He is operating with a mind and senses. So whatever he reasons about reality is only his perception. according to his own philosophy now. It's only his perception. What he reasons and understands and the knowledge he has of reality and these things that he is claiming is only indirect by his own admission. It is only his interpretation. So why should I even be concerned about it? Why should I even... It's just uninteresting. To use David Berlinski's way of talking about it. What he has to say is uninteresting. Because all he's saying is he knows what he knows. Well, I know what I know as well. It's uninteresting. Because if Immanuel Kant has no greater understanding of reality than we have, then he's on the same level that we are. So why should we even bother to listen to what he has to say? My reasoning, my understanding, my perception of things is as valid as his at this particular point. So why should I take these ideas seriously? That's the question. And the answer to that question is, if Kant is right, then we shouldn't. But the truth of the matter is, all of us live in a world where we not only assume, but we have a deep instinctive sense that the way we interact with the world and reality itself is direct in as much as it can be. That there is a sense in which the world as it is certainly does impact us in a more or less direct way through our senses and our experience. Now, all things being equal, I know that our perceptions can be distorted by chemicals or by alcohol or by mental disturbance or even emotional trauma and all of those kinds. We understand that there are caveats in all of this. But generally speaking, in our human nature, we are aware that our experience of reality is more or less, we live like, and the way we work in this world, we understand that there is a more or less direct relationship. How do we know? Because we experiment with it every day. We react to our experience of things in a way where we test and prove the validity of that experience over and over again. For example, this is a silly example. I like sugar in my tea, so I'm going to put sugar in my tea. And is there sugar in my tea? Well, I'm going to stir the cup and taste it. Doesn't taste like there's any sugar in it. So I'm I've forgotten to put the sugar in my tea. So I go and put some sugar in my tea. Then I taste it again, and I can taste the sugar in the tea. I am experimenting with reality. And every time I react to certain experiences through my senses, I then adjust my behavior or even adjust the circumstances so there is a direct sense in which we interact with and experiment with reality all the time. And we instinctively do this as human beings. Terrible illustration, but you get the point. Now, when this idea then is carried over to truth, the idea of truth, sociologists, educators, politicians, amateur philosophers, university professors, they all have this debate over truth, whether truth is absolute or relative. And we've come down on the side of saying that truth is unknowable. And the mantra that we see all the time and we experience as Christians in our debates over ethics is the statement, let's see here, there is no such thing as absolute truth. Have you heard that statement? There is no such thing as absolute truth. Absolute truth doesn't exist. Now, this is a carryover, of course, from Immanuel Kant's notion. We can only know truth through our senses, and therefore we must be agnostic about it. We don't really have a direct knowledge of truth. All we have is an indirect knowledge of truth through our senses. And so it is said there is no such thing as absolute truth. All truth, this is the way it's presented, all truth is relative. There is your truth and my truth and his truth and their truth, and there is some things are true in certain circumstances, and the same thing is not true in other circumstances. Truth is relative. So what do we do then with this philosophy in our world, in the secular worldview, where it comes into contact with the Christian worldview? Because in the Bible, truth is a central idea. If we know the truth about God, we know how God or what God truly is, really is. If we know the truth about the gospel and we believe the truth of the gospel, we have to believe not some view of the gospel, but what the gospel actually is. The Bible makes it clear that there are certain things that God, certain propositions that God makes to us about our lives, that we are sinners, for instance. Is that true? Is it reality that I am in fact a sinner in the eyes of God, that I am morally wrong in God's eyes? Is that true? Is it true that Jesus died on the cross for my sins? This is a propositional truth statement. And is it true that if I do not repent of my sin, that I will come under the judgment of God? Those are propositional. They are truth claims made in the Christian worldview that have to be dealt with and have to be considered. They are not presented to us from the Bible as being indirect or in any way negotiable. They are in fact presented to us. The Bible presents to us these truth claims in a way that they are non-negotiable. They are immutably true for all time and all people. But the world says, no, truth doesn't work like that. So how do we then negotiate the impasse between the Christian worldview of truth and the Christian idea of truth and the secular worldview? All right. So the secular worldview is that there is no such thing as absolute truth. So the first thing we have to do is we need to apply that question to the statement itself. So let me do it here. There is no such thing as absolute truth. Is that absolutely true? Is that statement absolutely true? And here comes the problem. It's the same problem that Immanuel Kant faced with his philosophy of not being able to know reality truly or directly. If we say, yes, this truth statement is absolutely true, so the truth statement that states there is no such thing as absolute truth is absolutely true. Well, in that case, there is such a thing as absolute truth, and here it is, this truth statement, according to your worldview. Of course, that's absurd, because then we're back into one of these circular, self-contradictory things. When you say there is no such thing as absolute truth, but this statement is absolutely true, then it contradicts itself. So it's self-defeating. It cannot be true and the system that it represents coherent at the same time, because it contradicts itself. So the statement is incoherent and it is self-contradictory. So what does that mean then? What are the implications of that? The implication is then that all truth must be absolute. If truth cannot be relative, and that statement, the self-contradictory nature of that statement makes it plain that truth the truth cannot be relative. If truth cannot be relative, then all truth is absolute. That is, all truth All truth statements, if it's a truth statement, all truth statements represent reality. They represent how things are. That is actually the definition of truth. So whatever these other things are, when we say, well, this is your truth, and this is your truth, and this is their truth, and this is how I see things, and this is my truth, and so forth. This idea that truth is relative, whatever it is, those things are not truth. They are something else. If we accept the proper definition of what truth is, that truth is, in fact, the way, the assertion of the way things are. If that makes sense to you. So you cannot argue that there is a different view of truth over here than over here. And you cannot argue that two contradictory things can be true at the same time, because it violates the law of non-contradiction. Because reality, not because someone made up the rule that two contradictory things cannot be true at the same time, but because reality is that way. Reality, the way things are, does not allow two contradictory things to exist at the same time. They cannot exist at the same time. A cannot be non-A at the same time. It cannot. A can be A, but it cannot be non-A at the same time. It cannot. That is the nature of reality. Either it is a dog or it is a cat. It cannot be a dog and a cat at the same time unless you're changing the definitions of truth. Now, what you can say is, in my opinion, that's a dog. And in my opinion, that's a cat. In my view, this is a dog. And in my view, this is a cat. And someone else can say, no, in my view, that's a cat. And this is a dog. That's my view. That's how I see it. We can have different points of view. But the truth is that this really is, I can't remember which side I came down on, this is a cat and this is a dog, in actual fact, in reality. Didn't know which way I was pointing. All right. So all truth then is absolute. If a thing is true, it is absolutely true. If a statement is made that represents reality, then it is absolutely true. We live our lives and we conduct ourselves as though truth can be known, because we know instinctively how truth works. And in our lives, we rely upon the truthfulness of things, because we cannot live without some kind of trustworthy reference points in order to make our way through this life. We need truth. We don't go and seek out someone who has an invalid view of truth to buy a car from them. We go to someone who we believe is going to be truthful about the vehicle that they're selling to us. We don't go to a financial manager who has a fuzzy view of truth or a fuzzy view of reality and say, I want you to manage my $1 million. We go to someone that we can trust, someone that we believe is going to be truthful to us. That is, they're going to tell us what actually is and not what they want us to hear or how they view things. Okay, I hope that makes sense to you. So in our relationships, we employ this idea. So how then are we going to determine truth? How do we know then what is true? Now, we're talking about, in theory, truth is absolute. It represents reality. But how can we know it? Can we know it? Because that also is part of the equation in this conversation. I think this, you think this, and so forth. And one of the issues that we do run up against is, and all this business of truth being relative, is this agnosticism about truth. We can't really know it then. Well, actually we can. And we do it all the time. So how do we then, what is the process that we as human beings go through in order to establish truth? Well, number one, first thing we have to do is we have to evaluate what we hear and see and experience for its truthfulness. Now, I'm going to use an illustration here, and I'm going to use a biblical illustration. When we get into the Bible makes what we call propositional truth claims. The Bible, not all of the truth that we learn about God is propositional, but there are some propositional truth claims about God. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's a propositional truth claim. Do we know whether or not it really is accurate? Did God, in fact, really create the heavens and the earth? In order for us to draw a conclusion as to the truthfulness of that statement, we have to investigate it. We have to investigate. We have to look at it. There may be even a sense in which we have to investigate it from the point of view of a provisional acceptance of that truth. We do it all the time. We provisionally accept a truth statement, or we provisionally accept a perception of something, and then we proceed on the basis of that perception and provisional acceptance to experiment and test it to see if our perception is correct or not. Now, this is called the scientific method in modern contemporary culture. We employ the scientific method as a matter of the way we conduct our lives all the time. We test things. I don't remember whether I warmed those baked beans up. So I go over to the stove and I kind of wave my hand over the pot to see if there's any heat coming off of it. I think I did. I'm pretty sure I did. And so I assume. Now, what I don't do is stick my hand in the pot, but I assume, I'm pretty sure I heated them up, so I'm assuming that I did heat them up, and I'm going to test it. So, yes, I did, I'm sure I did, but I'm going to wave my hand over the pot to see if there's any heat coming out. Now, it's a silly illustration, but it's a way of trying to understand this thing. We do this all the time. We test truth statements by experimentation, and even provisionally accept them. And then if it turns out that when we examine them and we test them, they don't meet the necessary criteria of proof and evidence of their truthfulness, then we will let it go. So what happens when we come to the Bible is God says to us, taste and see that the Lord is good. This is the scientific method presented to us in the Bible a long time ago, before science in its present form was ever recognized. God says to us, God makes truth statements about himself. God invites us to test him. Now, it's not test him in the sense of testing him morally, but experimenting, coming to him and accepting his invitation to discover if he is really what he claims to be. That's what the invitation of the gospel is all about. Repent and believe. Put your trust in God and find out for yourself the truth of the gospel. We cannot find out the truth of the gospel based basically on a mental exercise, but we have to put our faith in God. There is a provisional acceptance that then can be tested, and God invites us to do that. All over the place we are invited to do that. It's not just that the Bible does this. Human life is filled with these. We have the best washing powder. It is the best detergent that you could ever imagine. You need to buy this. And so we go out to the store. We don't know if the claim is true, but we buy a box and we take it home and we use it to test it if it's going to work. We accept the claim provisionally and then we test it. God invites us to come to him in surrender and acceptance of the gospel in order to prove its validity. Now that proof is going to be forthcoming very quickly, and we're going to be convinced very quickly, I can assure you. In another place in the book of Proverbs, we are told that the beginning of wisdom, that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. How do we get started in a relationship with God? It starts with respect for Him, surrender to Him, coming to God in a way that is respectful and surrendered and humble so that God can begin to work in our lives and prove Himself to us as truthful and valid and real. We do it all the time. When people object to the idea of what I've just said to you, that that's not what faith is all about. It's exactly what faith is all about. Faith is not based upon an open-ended thing where we don't have any information or any proof or any evidence. Faith is based upon God calling us to evaluate the evidence and put our trust in Him. He says it in the Word all the time. Not only that, but everything in life works that way. In our interaction with reality, and this is Immanuel Kant didn't, I don't know, he may have said this, I don't know. But Immanuel Kant, I didn't see anything that indicated he said this. Immanuel Kant, our experience of reality always involves us accepting something provisionally and then proving it by experimentation or by acting upon that information and that provisional acceptance. It's the way we do business in the world. And therefore, we should not be surprised to see that the Bible calls upon us to approach God in this way, because this is the way that God created us. He created us in order to not just have a knowledge of Him implanted in us, but to have a knowledge of God that is discovery. Understand that, folks? So when we're talking about truth and reality, we are talking about the discovery of things. That's how reality works. That's how we understand it from our senses and the mental processes. We do it through discovery. And we have to discover God. We discover Him first through fear of the Lord. That is putting our respectful trust in God, tasting and seeing, making a commitment, coming to God, hearing His word, and listening to the approach and the appeal He makes to us, and evaluating it as being a reasonable invitation. And as a reasonable invitation, it's something that we want to provisionally accept so that we can discover God for ourselves. Now, I know this is a little bit preachy, okay. But anyway, so when we start talking to when we start confronting the secular worldview, and people say, well, that's faith. Well, the truth of the matter is, in human nature and in human circumstances, we evaluate things in the same way as the Bible is calling upon us to trust in, have faith in, and evaluate God. It's part of our normal human activity and the way we approach reality and life. So that's important for us. And it's important for us because the idea of knowing the truth and being able to evaluate the truth has an impact on these two other areas that we talked about. And justice. Judgmentalism and justice. The only way we can deal with these ideas of judgmentalism and justice is if we know the truth. Without truth, we cannot deal with judgmentalism. Why? Because from the secular world view perspective, they want us to obey a set of rules. And the rules are based upon certain ideas. And one is that it is wrong to judge. Well, that's a truth statement that needs to be evaluated. If we look at this as an absolute rule, is it absolutely wrong to judge? Under what circumstances is it wrong to judge? Or is it just wrong to judge in any sense? Or to make assessments? Or to evaluate things? In other words, we need to, and this is the subtlety of it, even when we discuss judgmentalism, we have to evaluate judgmentalism for its truthfulness. So truth is important. And when it comes to social justice, and we talk about social justice, is it true that there's inequity in the world? Well, that's probably self-evident, but yes. Well, is it true then that everybody is entitled to, has a right to, equal outcomes in everything? Is that true? Is it even possible? Truth also impacts. We have to evaluate the claims that are made in the name of social justice and judgmentalism from the secular world view perspective, and ask ourselves, are these objectively true? Are the claims that are being made here, we've already evaluated the claim made for truth. There's no such thing as absolute truth. We've evaluated that. But we're going to have to do the same for these two ideas. But is what is being said in behalf of the judgmentalism crowd and the justice crowd, is it objectively true, and does it represent reality? Does it represent things the way they really are? Or how they ought to be? Okay? Now, what we're going to get into with these two ideas is that we actually have an ethic that comes out, and I'm going to step aside so you can see that, but we actually have an ethic that is now coming out of the secular worldview. Whereas Christian ethics and the whole idea of right and wrong are now being questioned as invalid categories of representing human behavior, we have now, coming out of the movement that is actually saying these things, we don't want ethical values, we don't want moral values, because it leads to judgmentalism, it leads to injustice, and here are the rules by which we want to get rid of those rules. And so we all now what we have is a substitutionary ethic, a different moral code that has been developed in the secular worldview. It is not possible then to live life without an ethic or moral code. As human beings, if we're going to live in community with one another, we have to have moral guidelines and boundaries, as we've already said. None of us wants to live in a world where everybody does exactly what they want to do. We've already covered that. All right. God bless you. We look forward to seeing you in our next lesson. That will be, next video, lesson 4 and video 2. And we will talk about judgmentalism, and we will talk about social justice.